morning, everyone. Thank you all for your attendance today. We're excited to have you. I am Chris Collier, recently retired CFO from Flex and the executive advisor here at TCC. And today, we're on point with some really good discussion on the supply chain disruptions, geopolitical realignment, and inflation, and all those disruptions and impacts that are causing havoc across your businesses and many others. As you know, all of you have been experiencing these very challenging times firsthand, and witnessing from these earnings releases this past week. You can see whether it's an Apple, whether it's an in-phase Ford, everyone is really struggling in trying to figure out how to manage these massive dislocations across any geography and across really any industry. So we're excited to have with you today, a unique perspective. What we have is we have someone from the banking side, we have an expert from the sponsor side, we have an expert from the commercial and the operational side, as well as technical and accounting side. And all of our panels have been very active in rethinking strategies, how to address these challenges facing your business today. And, we anticipate that you're going to find some interesting perspectives as we go through this discussion. So with that, let me take a couple minutes here to let the panelists introduce themselves, tell a little bit about their background as well as their industry, and then we'll get into it. Sanjay?
Thank you very much, Chris. My name is Sanjay Bonde. I'm the CEO Chairman for Trade Capital Corporation. We're based in the Bay Area in California and actively involved in capital as a service or financing of inventories. It's a pleasure to have you. I welcome everyone. Reading at the newspapers today and over the last couple of days, this is a very pertinent topic, and I'm just glad that we're having it in the nick of time. So thank you very much for joining. Chris, appreciate it.
Andreas?
Good morning, everyone. Andreas Neumeier here. I'm head of corporate banking and TMT at Truist. Securities. Truist is a relatively new organization that was formed by the merger of SunTrust and BB&T. I have previously worked at Standard Chartered Bank and at Deutsche Bank, and all these organizations have a very strong DNA in the trade finance world. So I've been involved as a corporate banker with many corporates around the globe in solving trade financing and working capital issues. And I'm delighted to be on this panel here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jason Rissanen. I'm an audit partner at Deloitte. I also lead our Bay Area technology audit practice here. So I've spent my career serving mostly really large companies, many of which have really complex supply chain issues. So I've worked through kind of many securitizations and other types of supply chain financing. We also kind of, as Deloitte, have a large advisory practice helping companies through these, not only on the audit side, but just helping companies navigate through the accounting for these things on the front end. So look forward to the discussion, and I think I'll pass it to Christian for an intro.
Thanks, Jason. I'm Christian Bauwens, the corporate treasurer at Flex, previously known as Flextronics. We're a global supply chain manufacturer with presence in over 30 countries. We manufacture products for over 1,000 customers from multiple industries, including healthcare, automotive, industrial, telecom, and consumer device, and many others.
Great. Well, thank you all for participating today. So let's just jump right in. I'm going to start asking just some questions directed at each of the panelists, and they'll be right around themes that are very relevant around today's landscape, and I'll try to work in any other Q&A that the attendees are submitting. So let me first start with a question to you, Andreas. Where do banks stand today with respect to helping clients financing trade and optimizing working capital?
Thanks, Chris. Well, I think banks, have strengths and weaknesses in doing that as we look at it today, and as we look at it in the context of what large corporates needs. And we should notice that the needs of corporates in terms of supply chain finance have actually evolved, right? It's not exactly the same what it was 20 years ago. Historically, banks have been the to-go institution for working capital optimization and trade finance. The banks have large infrastructures in place. They have the funding sources in place. And they have the global networks to satisfy the needs of corporates that are globally operating and have complex supply chains. I would say that on the payable side, if we start over there, banks do supply chain finance programs, and they do them well, reasonably well, I would say. Those are also known as reverse factoring or confirmed payables. That's an area that kind of I would put in the bucket of works, even though there are some things to improve, and we'll talk about that a little later. Then we can focus on inventory. What are banks doing in the inventory space? And I think, again, there is a strength, which is, financing inventory on balance sheet, providing efficient funding is something banks have done well and continue to do well. Partially also driven by the fact that banks want to build relationship with corporates, and that's an easy way to engage and to do that. When we now switch over and think about receivables, I think we touched on it in the intro a little bit. There are many ways banks help today to monetize receivables, and I think they're doing it reasonably well. There's the one-off purchase programs. There is receivable purchases that banks put on their balance sheets, and then there is the role that banks play with, opening up the public market funding for corporates to place receivables like securitizations and other structures there. So that's kind of what works. Where it gets a little harder is when we think about the monetization of future receivables that are in long-term contracts, right? Corporates are often looking to monetize those, and that's something that is more difficult and challenging. There can be a service element that banks can't really deal with unless it's separated. And then there's also the creation of the receivable. Actually, when does the receivable exist? That can go on a balance sheet. In general, banks, though, are better positioned to deal with receivables than we are positioned to deal with inventory. Right? Inventory is difficult. We're not in the business of assessing the value of inventory, and we're not in the business of monetizing inventory should we have to. And therefore, banks just place less value against it, and it's a tougher thing for us to do. Even though if we look at at the underlying corporate, and we can do something where the risk is actually not purely the inventory, then it becomes easy again. And I think this is where a lot of the future conversations here will be going. What's good and bad about banks is also the fact that we are highly regulated, right? On one hand, what that does is it does provide trust, it does provide transparency. On the other hand, banks are not able to be as nimble and innovative when it comes to new structures, right? We have a disadvantage there because we have embedded risk organizations, we have policies in place that authorities are looking over our shoulders consistently, and we need to justify that everything we do is really, really making sense, right? I mean, talk about trust and transparency. The Greensill situation is a good example of where that doesn't exist. And this is why I think, banks will actually play a material role going forward, even in more innovative structures. What banks have not done well historically is using technology to create a better user experience and create additional efficiencies, right? We touched a little bit on supply chain finance programs. Because banks didn't innovate and didn't invest enough early enough, organizations like Collier are very successful today because they came in and they captured that opportunity extremely well. And I think we will see more of that, or we have already seen more of that. So there is an area where banks kind of didn't do the right thing early enough, and now banks look to partner and improve. It's good though for corporates, right? Because there is alternatives to look at, and I think there'll be cooperation between fintechs and banks in the future, where the best of both worlds can come together for the benefit of our clients. I think the final point I make is that there is a lot of liquidity in the bank market today. There's almost with no exception, all banks are looking to deploy liquidity with some acceptable returns. And the working capital optimization space and the trade finance space, from my perspective, remain to be very, very attractive areas for banks to deploy the liquidity. So I think we will see a continued drive and curiosity and real effort from banks to be more innovative, to be more nimble in solving very specific client needs across the board, but particularly in the inventory space, which you touched on earlier in the opening. So I think that's where the banks stand today.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you, Andreas. And maybe Sanjay, pulling a little further onto that, clearly, there's greater interest and opportunity for these solutions today. What do you see as the underlying catalysts for trade finance now, and how are you positioning solutions to address that?
Chris, that's an interesting question. Trade finance means many things to many people. So I think we can understand that receivables financing, payables financing, ABL lines, as working capital provisioning. We have so many different tools. I think if you look at the scenario today, the problem that we are really dealing with is lack of inventories, lack of supply, is the whole supply chain procurement system that is not working at its best. And I think intercepting that and being able to provision capital for inventories that Andreas alluded to is very important, and perhaps the last frontier. It's easy to do receivables and payables financing because you have a counterparty, you understand risk much easier. In case of inventory, you have to have contracts that are well governed, transparent between the parties. And I think as we see trade finance, we see it particularly in terms of providing value to corporates, where inventories are going to bloat over a period of the next 2-3 years. I think there's going to be excess inventory holdings. We can also see that the supplier power is at its highest right now. Over the decade or so, suppliers did not have as much power, other than a few monopolistic ones. By and large, supplier power had diminished significantly, but today it's not that case. I think everybody's scrambling to get whatever they could get from suppliers. So AP terms are going to contract, inventories are going to bloat, and lead times are only going to increase. Coupled with that, logistics costs, we already know that in terms of shippings, the way port handling processes have slowed down, labor shortages, they are all associated with materials, inventories, components coming to the manufacturing sites. And I'm talking about manufacturing entities. So this is an important issue to be dealt with. It has direct relation to how an economy performs. We have read newspapers today about how GDPs are going to get compromised this quarter and next quarters to come if supplies don't reach on time, including holiday seasons and the type. So I think it's time we befriend that. It's time that the fintech, as Andreas said, comes together to do the more difficult job of financing inventories in the supply chain without consuming the capital of corporates and allowing them to do their job more efficiently with their capital. I think that's where I see this going, Chris.
Great. All right, perfect. Thank you for that. Perhaps it's relevant to get a perspective from an operator, from the commercial and operational side. Christian, given your perch where you sit at Flex, which oversees some of the world's largest supply chains, today, what are you and your team assessing in terms of inventory management solutions, and what are the criteria you're using to assess those, and how important is flexibility today for you?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And in fact, it's a very timely discussion. We had earnings release a couple of days ago, where we touch on the shortages, the component shortages impacting our industry and globally many companies, right, and many industries. So what Sanjay touched on is absolutely relevant for corporates like us, right? If you think about inventory situation, you have the need in the current complex supply chain environment we live in to have buffer inventory, to make sure that you can actually rely and you have enough capacity to manufacture the products. And and not have necessarily, to wait for one component to actually finalize your product, right? What we call clear to build issues that companies like Flex and others are facing today. So having access to inventory is absolutely key. A buffer inventory, the longer lead time, we're seeing that across the various industries. Sanjay mentioned it. We see now sometimes lead time of a year or longer, which is unprecedented, right, in the world. So all of that makes inventory certainly becoming a little more strategic. Now, on companies like us, we have a weighted average cost of capital of a certain level. Investing in inventory, while it's needed, it's obviously costly. So we are always looking at ways to minimize the cost of holding inventory and working capital in general. If we look at how we do business, it's typically very important to come up with a solution, working capital funding solution for customers, because they expect us to do that. So it's a strategic, competitive issue, how we actually can structure working capital financing is very strategic for us, very relevant. And as Sanjay mentioned, we see this becoming more relevant in today's environment, given the inventory situation.
I'm going to try to answer one of these questions we just got in live here. Perhaps, Christian, seems like longer inventory hold times are here to stay. Would these financing alternatives be competitive for longer holding periods? Actually, this would be a question more for Andreas or Sanjay. Again, would these financing alternatives be competitive for longer holding periods?
Maybe, Andreas, I can take a dig at it, and if you can try and see if I make sense. Longer holding periods, I totally agree with you, Christian, that you would see 6 months, would be very table stakes for inventory lead times. The capacities in manufacturing are not at full. And the ones that are at full are the ones that everybody wants. We already know about TSMC. I mean, there's to knock the door of TSMC, and you know when you get your phone call back. So I think it's going to be 6 months to a year. I think the ability to use long-term capital depends on, I would say, banks would not be very comfortable doing any business which is more than 1 year in terms of short-term assets. There's a very distinct way that you would treat short-term capital financing versus long-term, and I'll let Andreas comment on it. But up to a year, I think we can deal with it in terms of off-balance sheet or outsourced financing using the structures that we talk about. The important item for us would be to see how inventories get consumed, and consumption is going to be watched more carefully. So it's not a parking lot to put inventory for, let's just say, an endless period of time. So I think with that responsibility, we can certainly handle it. And with the clients that we are looking to do business, there are two ways. Over these years, supply chain management folks, including finance, procurement, the supply chain execs, were optimizing cost. And when you optimize cost, you diminish levels of inventories held across the system. And now it's exactly the antithesis of that. So you've got to put in capital to get higher inventories. So I think there would be some trade-offs. And because we are able to leverage our companies better than corporates, we could lever our companies 6 or 8 times. Our weighted average cost of capital would be a bit better. And I'll hand it over to Andreas to see his ideas on this, please.
Yes, Sanjay, your statement about 1 year in and out is largely correct. So yes, banks, we look at short term and everything, 1 year and inside is considered short term. I would say though that, I wouldn't be so concerned about the longer lead times and the tenor of the associated financing to it. Even if it goes a little bit beyond the 1 year mark. I think what's important for banks is, does the structure that we put in place on which the financing is based, provide a clear path to look at the ultimate buyer as the obligor. And if the ultimate buyer is somebody that the bank can understand and assess the risk, then that will lead to the ability to lend against that. So from a bank's perspective, the The issue is more about the structure of the financing, the connectivity to the ultimate buyer, and then, is this that this construct holds up if there ever was a bankruptcy or something? Like, I'm putting my risk management hat on for a moment. Those are the key things. But I think 1 year is definitely very common. Anything inside there, not a problem. I think beyond 1 year is possible in certain situations. So I wouldn't be concerned per se about not being able to do the longer tenors. It's all about the structure.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So again, I'd like to remind everyone, if you have a question, there's the button on the bottom of the Q&A button. Please submit that and we'll try to incorporate that into the conversation. Sanjay, you had said a comment around off-balance sheet in a response a little bit ago. Mm-hmm. I always liked that term when I was a CFO. I know that Jason maybe gets a bit more uncomfortable when he hears off-balance sheet. Maybe Jason, we can shift over. Off-balance sheet often has had negative connotations. And then with the collapse of Greensill, as Andreas had highlighted earlier, it really created some concerns for supply chain financing. Given today's challenging environment, CFOs want, they really want to embrace opportunities that freed up capital provides. What are some of the challenges today, and how are accounting firms advising their clients in this area?
It's a great question, Chris. The reality is that off-balance sheet shouldn't be viewed as a bad thing or a good thing. It's just playing within the accounting rules. I mean, the accounting rules are very clear as to what should, or sometimes very clear as to what should be on balance sheet, what should be off balance sheet. I think the larger challenge that companies get into, and auditors and the SEC and others are wary of it, is when off-balance sheet transactions aren't disclosed and nobody knows about them, right? So I'll come back to that in a little bit. But regarding your initial comment on the challenges, I'll focus my comments on inventory financing programs. If you think working capital financing as a whole, AR factoring, AR sales, AR securitizations, those types of things are pretty well worn ground at this point. The accounting can still be really complex. You can get to bad answers, of leaving those programs on balance sheet if you're not careful and you're not, getting the right advice from the right accountants. But those have been around for years and I think pretty well worn. The inventory financing side or kind of other supply chain financing side, I would say the rules do bias towards leaving inventory on the books. There's ways around it. There's, as with any accounting rule, you can play within the rules and get to a better accounting answer for your company. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of work and a little bit of negotiation. And when I think about the inventory or supply chain financing accounting guidance, it really broadly covers two sets of transactions. So, one would be if you have inventory and you sell it to a financial intermediary or just any intermediary and you have an agreement to buy it back, or if that intermediary buys directly from your suppliers, holds it for you, and then gives it, sells it to you or passes on to you when you need it. So the accounting rules kind of cover both flavors of that. And like I said, I think in a vacuum, the rules would suggest that you would put that inventory on your books and you would have a financing obligation for it. But again, this is an area of GAAP that is very, very form driven, very rules driven, and words do matter in the contracts. Even if the substance of a transaction is to finance inventory, there are ways to get it off balance sheet within the confines of the rules. And one simple example on that is, if the arrangement truly, if the economics of the arrangement truly are that the intermediary gets to pass on all interest rate risk and all holding period risk, then it really just feels like you're financing inventory and you should have it on your balance sheet. But what we've seen is some companies get creative with their intermediaries where the pricing may be fixed for a month or a quarter based on estimated holding periods, estimated interest rates. So for any actual piece of inventory that is transferred or held by the intermediary, that pricing is fixed, but then there's a pretty quick reset mechanism so that intermediary isn't stuck with holding risk for too long. They can reset prices after a month or a quarter on future sales, such that you can kind of get through the accounting guidance and make this not feel or not fall into the scope of the inventory financing guidance. So there are ways to work through these. I guess I would just give a couple pieces of advice, just as you wouldn't work through an agreement like this without consulting with your attorneys first, consult with your accountants first, because as I said, small differences in contracts can really make a change. And then, as you're doing that, we have seen, many situations where agreements come to a company. There's an assertion from somebody in the chain that don't worry, this is fine. It's been through another big four auditors like this. And again, sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not, but often, again, you can make a small change and foul up that accounting. So just be careful, buyer beware on this stuff, but there are ways to certainly fall within GAAP, get things off your balance sheet, and kind of help solve some of the problems that CFOs and treasurers are facing these days.
For sure. Thank you. That is super insightful, Jason. Looks like there's a question here. There's no liquidity crisis at present. Does outsourced inventory financing still make sense? Perhaps I'll throw this first to say Sanjay, and then from an operation perspective, maybe Christian can follow up.
I think this goes back to Finance 101 about where do you use your company's capital and where you don't. And I think Christian alluded to that. Weighted average cost of capital generally is expensive. As CFOs, we all know this. Equity is not for free. When two sets of capitals merge together, it's not necessarily an incremental cost of debt. And so pay attention to shareholders' returns, equity aspects of this. So I would use corporate capital more sparingly, more effectively on high yield projects than inventory. That would be my default setting, because if I can find somebody who is better leverage with lower cost of capital to fund weighted average cost of capital to fund my inventory, I'll take it. And I think that would be for any public company or a well-to-do company, I would say, with a debt equity gearing of 1:1, you can expect that your weighted average cost would be at least 2 times of that of a normal debt scenario. So it's pretty much a no-brainer. I think it's about decision making and more astute financial decision making at this time. That's what I would say.
Andreas, anyone else want to extend a little?
I can certainly give the corporate side. So basically, the answer is, in our view, yes, but you have to manage risk appropriately. So it's great to have, cheaper cost of funds to fund your business, but obviously you need to make sure that a couple of things are kind of, addressed, right? One is you want to make sure that any structure you work on is actually effective in a bankruptcy remote way, right? So you want to make sure that your partners are financially healthy, not just that they have ways to give cheap funding, but they're financially healthy. And, obviously the Greensill situation illustrated that it's really an important criteria who you partner with. And secondly, it's also about duration, right, of funding. Obviously, you can always get cheaper funding source by funding yourself in a very short term, uncommitted lines, and everyone knows that that's the cheapest source of funding, but it's also the riskiest one, right? Mm-hmm. So as you look from a risk perspective, you need to make sure that sometimes it pays to make sure that your credit lines that you use directly or indirectly are going to be there for a certain period of time. Because right now, as the attendant said, liquidity is easy, but there will be time of crisis. We all know that. You will come back. You will have a 2008 comeback or even a March 2020 coming back, and that's part of the business, right? So you need to make sure that it's not just cost, it's also making sure that your partner are healthy, and that sometimes it makes sense to pay a little bit more to secure longer term, fundings.
Yeah, that's very on point. Andreas, is there anything you want to extend there with regards to being thoughtful around the risk management need here?
Well, I think to Christian's point, what banks can do relative in contrast to a Greensill scenario, right? If banks are a funding source, the bank is typically known, the bank group is typically known, we're regulated, we're consistent there. We have more than just an interest of financing a transaction. We actually have an interest in a broader, longer-term relationship with the stakeholders. So I think the banks fit the need that Christian just described really, really well. We just need to also make sure that from a risk management perspective, we can do this. And Jason alluded to this, that wherever the inventory is parked, there needs to be some risk where that inventory is. And that's exactly where it gets a little harder, because from a banking perspective, I would love nothing more than a hard purchase obligation from Christian that he needs to buy something, and then I can finance that all day long. So that's where we get into it. But from what Christian said is absolutely right. And I think the banks could play a good role in that if we find the right structure.
Great, thank you. So we're running up on time here. Maybe there's a question here that we'll take and just call this the last one. I think essentially should go to Sanjay. So Sanjay, to close out today's discussion, how do you see inventory financing helping to address supply chain shortages?
Well, interesting. So what we cannot do is produce something that doesn't exist. There's no magician here. There's no silver bullet. Can't create a capacity that doesn't exist or a part that has not been built. So I don't think we can do that. What we can do, and we can do very effectively, is to give a very powerful tool to business companies, corporations, and businessmen like Christian, for example, the ability to use finance as a tool to prioritize inventory purchases, to pay suppliers earlier, for example, flexible terms, and be able to build a sustainable relationship with suppliers. I think today's suppliers are looking, with whatever they produce, they're looking to allocate their products to companies that they can work in a trusted environment. And they want consistency. If you agree to pay them in certain number of days, you're going to pay them in certain number of days. And 30 cannot be 75, cannot be 90. And I think they're going to ask for shorter terms. So I think building consistency, the ability to buy and hold inventories for a longer period of time, as long as it is consumed, that's a really good tool for corporates now. Earlier, we used to say just in time, but now we need just in case inventories. We would need to keep inventories for a little bit longer. We can't have production down or miss our numbers. And on top of it, I think it's also a resiliency and a hedging factor, because we see that inflation is going to be going nowhere but up. If you look at all the indications, whether it's labor or logistics or manufacturing costs, I think it's going to be heading north. And the interest rates are not going to be heading north as fast as inflation would, in my perception. And I think there's an ability for us to hedge by bringing these components on, holding them, consuming it. So there's also benefits to be taken. I think this risk-reward relationship tension that we talked about is important to be managed through contracts and auditors, and we should be able to help that process. So I think delivering this power to a company, especially treasurers as well as supply chain procurement staff, is what can enable them to prioritize themselves over others, and therefore create winning organizations, is what I would say.
Perfect. Definitely covered a lot of ground today through this dialogue, and hopefully you all are stepping away with some more insight and intelligence that could be useful as you battle in this dynamic environment. Again, there's some questions that we probably didn't get to. Subsequent to the call, we'll be responding to your questions with a follow-up email. I'd like to take time right now to thank the panelists for your efforts and time today, and also thank you all for attending. And with that, I'll just turn it over to Sanjay for some closing remarks.
I thank you for your time. I mean, the audience, we have a distinguished audience here, and there is this very topical subject that is being handled by all our panelists. Everyone here has a lot of experience under our belt, and I think we can continue this dialogue forward. I think I'd like to continue this dialogue, and receive inputs on what subjects we should cover. This subject is not going to go away over the next 2 years, and there are different nuances, intricacies involved with trade finance and making companies resilient. The interplay of finance, fintech, and business. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your attention, and I think we can make our companies better as we go along. So, welcome that, Chris.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.